In the year 1140 BC, a young woman named Valeria stood in the Forum Romanum, wearing the distinctive white robes and elaborate hairstyle of a Vestal virgin. She had served Rome's sacred flame for nearly 15 years, and now she was about to die. The pontiffs had already pronounced their verdict, guilty of incestum, the breaking of her vow of chastity. The punishment was ancient, prescribed by tradition stretching back centuries. She would be taken beyond the city walls to a place near the Porta Collina, where a small underground chamber had been prepared. There, she would be sealed inside with a lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, some milk, and a small amount of oil. Then the earth would be heaped over the entrance, and she would be left to the gods. But here's what makes Valeria's story more complex than you might imagine. She wasn't some helpless victim plucked from obscurity. She'd been one of the most powerful women in Rome. She had rights that no other Roman woman possessed, not even the wives of senators or the daughters of generals. She could own property without a male guardian. She could make her own will. She had the best seats at the theater and the gladiatorial games. Condemned criminals could be pardoned simply by accidentally crossing her path on the street. And now, she was being buried alive. If you're interested in the complicated truth about women's lives in the ancient world, how power and vulnerability could exist in the same person, how privilege came with suffocating restrictions, how religious authority created both opportunity and danger, then stay with me. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious about where these stories reach because what I'm about to tell you challenges everything you think you know about ancient Rome, about religious power, and about what freedom actually means. The story of the Vestal Virgins is not a simple tale of oppression or empowerment. It's both. It's neither. It's something far stranger and more revealing about how human societies work than any comfortable narrative could ever be. Let me take you back to how this all began, to understand what happened to Valeria, to Aemilia, to Flavia, to all the women who wore the white robes and tended Rome's eternal flame. You need to understand what a Vestal Virgin actually was. And I promise you, it's nothing like what you've been told. The origins of the Vestal cult reach back into the mists of Rome's founding. According to tradition, King Numa Pompilius established the order in the 8th or 7th century BC, though the exact date is lost to time. He created 6 priestesses, always 6, no more, no less, whose sole duty was to maintain the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. The fire could never go out. This wasn't superstition or mythology to the Romans. This was reality. The eternal flame represented the life force of Rome itself. If it died, Rome would fall. The city's survival depended on those 6 women keeping that fire burning year after year, generation after generation. But here's where it gets interesting. To tend this fire, to maintain Rome's very existence, you couldn't be just anyone. The requirements were extraordinarily specific, and they tell us everything about what Romans actually believed about purity, power, and female bodies. First, age. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, would select candidates between the ages of 6 and 10 years old. Not younger, not older. They had to be prepubescent, physically intact, representing the perfect state before womanhood began. Second, family. Initially, only patrician families, Rome's ancient aristocracy, could provide Vestals. Your parents had to be alive, married to each other, and living respectably. You couldn't have physical or mental defects. You had to be, in the eyes of Roman law, absolutely perfect. The selection process was called captio, taking or capture. 20 candidates would be presented to the Pontifex Maximus. He would choose one. The moment she was selected, something extraordinary happened. The girl was legally freed from her father's power, the pater potestas that governed every other Roman woman's entire life. She didn't pass from her father's control to her husband's control, as every other Roman woman did. She became something unprecedented in Roman law, a woman who belonged to no man. Let me introduce you to Julia. Not the one who died in 1104 BC, but an earlier Amelia, who lived in the 2nd century BC. We know about her from Cicero, who mentions her decades later in a legal speech. Amelia was chosen at age 7, taken from her family's house on the Palatine Hill and brought to the house of the Vestals in the Forum. This ceremony that transformed her was carefully scripted. The Pontifex Maximus took her hand and spoke the ancient formula. I take you, Amata, to be a Vestal priestess to perform the rites which it is lawful for a Vestal priestess to perform on behalf of the Roman people on the same terms as her who was a Vestal priestess, on the best terms. Amata. Beloved. Every Vestal was called Amata at her induction, regardless of her birth name. It was the first step in creating a new identity, separate from her family, belonging only to Vesta. Her hair was styled in the Sikrenes, 6 braids, wound around her head, a style otherwise worn only by brides on their wedding day. This wasn't coincidence. A Vestal occupied the liminal space that other Roman women passed through quickly, the transition from daughter to wife. But a Vestal stayed there forever, suspended between girlhood and womanhood, between family and family, belonging nowhere and everywhere at once. Now here's what the romantic versions of this story never tell you. Amelia's family didn't volunteer her out of piety or honor. Suetonius records that in Augustus's time, families used their influence to keep their daughters from being selected. Many tried desperately to avoid having a daughter chosen. Augustus himself claimed he would have offered his own granddaughter if she'd been the right age, trying to shame reluctant aristocrats into cooperation. Why the resistance? Because once elected, a girl was gone. Not dead, but gone. She would live for 30 years in the house of the Vestals, 10 years learning her duties, 10 years performing them, 10 years teaching the younger priestesses, 30 years of virginity, 30 years without marriage, without children, without the normal life trajectory of a Roman woman. But in exchange for what she gave up, she received something no other Roman woman could have. Let me be very clear about this, because it's crucial to understanding the whole story. Vestals had legal and social powers that were absolutely extraordinary. A Vestal could own property in her own name. She could make her own will without male permission. These rights seem small until you understand that every other Roman woman, every single one, regardless of wealth or family, needed a male guardian to conduct legal business. A senator's wife couldn't sell property without her husband's or father's or brother's consent. A Vestal could buy and sell at will. Vestals had the power of sacrosanctity, the same legal protection as tribunes of the people. Assault a Vestal and you face death. Their persons were inviolable. When a Vestal traveled through Rome's streets, she was preceded by a lictor, the same official that walked before magistrates, clearing the way and commanding respect. If a Vestal accidentally encountered a condemned criminal being led to execution, that criminal was immediately freed. The Vestal didn't have to do anything, didn't have to speak. Her mere presence was enough to overturn a death sentence. This wasn't courtesy or tradition, this was law. Vestals had the best seats at all public entertainments, gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, religious festivals. They sat in the front in positions of honor where everyone could see them. They were walking symbols of Rome's purity and power. And here's something that will surprise you. Vestals could give testimony in court without taking an oath. Every other witness had to swear they were telling the truth. Not Vestals. Their word was assumed to be truthful. They were legally incapable of lying. They stored wills and important documents, including the wills of emperors. They had access to state secrets. They witnessed treaties. In the later Republic and early Empire, they became political players in their own right, using their neutral status to mediate between factions, to plead for mercy for condemned men, to carry messages between enemies who trusted no one else. In 143 BC, a Vestal named Claudia did something unprecedented. Her brother, or possibly father, the consulus Claudius Pulcher, had been denied a triumph by the Senate, he decided to celebrate one anyway. A tribune tried to physically stop the triumphal chariot. Claudia threw herself onto the chariot, using her sacred status to protect her brother. The tribune couldn't touch her without committing a capital crime. The triumph proceeded. This was power, real, tangible political power, wielded by a woman in a society that gave women almost no power. So why am I telling you all this? Because you need to understand what a Vestal was before you can understand what happened to Vestals who broke their vows. They weren't powerless victims. They were among the most privileged people in Rome. And that makes what happened when they fell even more revealing about how Roman society actually worked. The vow was simple. Absolute chastity for 30 years. No sexual contact of any kind. The penalty for breaking this vow was death. But not just any death. Romans believed that spilling a Vestal's blood would pollute the city, so they developed a punishment that technically didn't kill her. They buried her alive. The process was described in detail by Plutarch, writing centuries later, but drawing on older sources. When a Vestal was convicted of breaking her vow, the crime called incestum, she would be dressed in burial clothes and placed on a covered litter, like a corpse being carried to a funeral. The litter would be carried through the forum in complete silence. People would part before it without speaking. The Vestal inside couldn't see out. She could only hear the footsteps, the terrible silence. The litter would be carried to a place near the Porticalina, one of Rome's gates. There, a small underground chamber had been prepared. Inside were placed a bed, a lamp with oil, a loaf of bread, water, and milk. Enough, Plutarch notes, to absolve the Romans of the charge of starving a sacred person to death. The Vestal would be led down into the chamber. The entrance would be sealed. Earth would be heaped over it until no trace remained of what lay beneath, and then everyone would leave. The Romans could claim they hadn't killed her. They had simply placed her underground with provisions. What happened after that was between her and the gods. If she was truly innocent, the gods would save her. If she was guilty, well, the gods would judge. This is what waited for Valeria, Julia, and Flavia in 114 BC. But here's where the story becomes more complicated, more political, more revealing about what was really happening in Rome at this time. Because the trial of these three Vestals wasn't really about sex. It was about power, crisis, and scapegoating in a republic tearing itself apart. The year 114 BC was a time of intense anxiety in Rome. The wars with Germanic tribes were going badly. There were rumors of defeats, of Roman legions destroyed. The social war was brewing. Rome's Italian allies were increasingly unhappy with their treatment. Political factions were at each other's throats. The old certainties were crumbling. And then a prodigy occurred. A young woman, the daughter of a knight, was struck by lightning and killed. In Roman belief, lightning strikes weren't random. They were messages from Jupiter, signs of divine displeasure. Something was wrong with Rome's relationship to the gods. Something needed to be fixed. The Haruspices, priests who interpreted omens, consulted their sacred books and delivered their verdict. The Vestals must be examined. Now pay attention to what happened next, because it reveals everything about how these trials actually worked. Three Vestals, Valeria, Julia, and Flavia, were accused of breaking their vows of chastity. The accusation came from a slave. Think about that. In Roman society, slaves couldn't normally testify against free persons, but in cases involving Vestals, normal rules were suspended. The pollution they supposedly caused was so dangerous that any evidence could be considered. The case was brought before the Pontifical College, the board of priests who had jurisdiction over religious crimes. They conducted their investigation and reached a verdict. Valeria was guilty. Julia and Flavia were innocent. Valeria was sentenced to be buried alive. The sentence was carried out. But the Roman people weren't satisfied. The crisis hadn't passed. The gods were still angry. Anyone could see that. Clearly, the Pontifical College had gotten it wrong. Two guilty Vestals were still walking free, still polluting the city.
popular pressure forced the Senate to act. They established a special court, headed by Lucius Cassius Longinus, to retry the case. This was extraordinary. The Pontifical College's jurisdiction over Vestals was supposed to be absolute, but political necessity overrode religious authority. The special court reached a different verdict. All 3 Vestals were guilty. Julia and Flavia were sentenced to be buried alive. Their alleged lovers' names have come down to us. Lucius Vittorius, Marcus, and Manius Aemilius were beaten to death in the Forum. Here's what you need to understand. There's no good evidence that any of these women or men were actually guilty. No one witnessed them together. No one testified to specific acts. The evidence seems to have consisted largely of the fact that young men had visited the house of the Vestals and that the Vestals had been seen talking with men at religious festivals. In other words, they were convicted of being friendly with men, of being young women who interacted with young men in the course of normal life in Rome. But Rome needed scapegoats. The gods needed to be appeased. The people needed to feel that something was being done about the crisis. And so 3 women who had dedicated their lives to serving Rome, who had extraordinary power and privilege, were put to death for crimes they very probably didn't commit. This is the dark heart of the Vestal system. The same privilege that gave them power also made them perfect sacrifices when things went wrong. They were separate from normal society, liminal, ambiguous, neither men nor women, neither children nor mothers, neither citizens with families nor slaves without rights. When Rome needed someone to blame, someone whose death would mean something, Vestals were available. And it happened again and again throughout Roman history. In 216 BC, during the darkest days of the Second Punic War, after the catastrophic defeat at Cannae, 2 Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were convicted of unchastity. One committed suicide, the other was buried alive. In 73 BC, a Vestal named Fabia was tried for incestum. She was acquitted, but only after a traumatic trial that destroyed her reputation. The suspicion was never fully lifted. In 90 AD, the Emperor Domitian became obsessed with restoring traditional Roman morality. He targeted the Vestals. Cornelia, the Vera Maxima, the chief of the Vestals, was accused of breaking her vow. She was buried alive, without even being given a trial. 3 other Vestals were also convicted. Domitian allowed them to choose their method of suicide rather than facing burial. Notice the pattern. These trials cluster around moments of crisis, military defeat, political upheaval, the transition from republic to empire. Whenever Rome felt threatened, whenever the old order seemed to be crumbling, Vestals were put on trial. The historian Holt Parker has argued that Vestals functioned as ritual scapegoats. Their deaths were meant to purify Rome, to restore the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods. Their guilt or innocence was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that they were ritually pure, set apart, and therefore effective sacrifices. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Remember all those privileges I described? The legal rights, the political power, the wealth, the honor. All of that made Vestals even more effective as scapegoats. The higher they stood, the more their fall meant. When an ordinary woman died, it didn't mean much. But when a Vestal died, a woman who had been set apart as sacred, who had power that other women couldn't dream of, her death carried weight. It was a real sacrifice, giving up something genuinely valuable. The system created women with unprecedented privilege specifically so that privilege could be taken away when Rome needed a spectacle of punishment. Now, let me tell you about the women who survived, because not every Vestal was executed. Most served their 30 years and retired to private life. And what happened to them reveals yet another layer of complexity in this story. After 30 years, a Vestal was free. She could leave the house of the Vestals, she could marry, she could finally live the life that other Roman women had lived decades earlier. But very few did. We have records of retired Vestals, some married, though they were typically in their late 30s or 40s by then, past the normal marriage age for Roman women. Most didn't marry. They lived out their wealth. Remember, they could own property and had no male relatives to claim their money. as independent women in a society that had no real category for independent women. Some continued to live in or near the house of the Vestals, maintaining informal connections to the order. Some became patrons, using their wealth to support younger Vestals or fund public works. We have inscriptions honoring these women, thanking them for their service, recording their donations, but you can hear the ambiguity in these inscriptions, the awkwardness of a society trying to figure out how to categorize women who no longer fit any normal role. They're honored, but the honors sound almost apologetic. They're wealthy, but their wealth sits uneasily in a system designed around male inheritance. They're free, but freedom at 40 after 30 years of restriction isn't the same as freedom at 20. There's a Vestal named Junia Torquater, whose story breaks my heart. She served from around 30 AD to 60 AD, through the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and into Nero's principate. She witnessed the madness of Caligula, the calculated cruelty of Nero. She kept the sacred fire burning while the world around her descended into chaos. She completed her service. She was free. And then we find inscriptions honoring her, erected by her family members, nephews and great-nephews she'd never really known, who were grateful for the honor she brought the family, but who treated her as a curiosity, a relic, a woman outside normal categories. She never married. She lived another 20 years after her retirement and was buried with honors, her tomb marked as that of a former Vestal. Even in death, that was her primary identity. Not daughter, not sister, not wife or mother, Vestal, forever defined by those 30 years. Let me tell you about the daily reality of life as a Vestal, because it's crucial to understanding what the system actually was. The House of the Vestals was located in the Roman Forum, right at the heart of Rome's religious and political life. It was a large complex with living quarters, working spaces, courtyards, and the Temple of Vesta itself, a small round building that housed the sacred flame. The Vestals lived communally, 6 women, ranging in age from prepubescent girls to women in their late 30s, sharing space, working together, bound by rules that governed every aspect of their lives. They woke before dawn. The sacred fire had to be tended constantly. Each Vest took shifts, ensuring the flame never died. If it went out, even accidentally, the responsible Vest would be whipped by the Pontifex Maximus. If it went out repeatedly, if it seemed like negligence rather than accident, worse punishments could follow. They made the mola salsa, sacred salted meal that was sprinkled on sacrificial victims. This was their exclusive duty. No one else could make it. Every public and private sacrifice in Rome used the mola salsa by the Vestals. Think about the power and the burden of that. Every time a farmer sacrificed a pig to ensure his crops grew, every time a general sacrificed before battle, every time a family made offerings to their household gods, the Vestals were there, represented by the mola salsa. Rome's entire religious system depended on 6 women performing this one task correctly. They stored the sacred objects, the exact nature of which remains mysterious even in ancient sources. The Palladium, supposedly brought from Troy by Aeneas, was one. It was said that Rome's survival depended on the Palladium. If it was lost or stolen, the city would fall. The Vestals guarded it. Only they could enter the inner sanctum where it was kept. Only they knew exactly what it looked like. Descriptions vary wildly in ancient sources, suggesting that no one outside the Vestals ever saw it clearly. They performed rituals throughout the year. The Vestalia, in June, when the inner sanctum was opened for a brief period and matrons could enter to make offerings. The Forcia and Perilia, in April, fertility festivals, where they sacrificed a pregnant cow and distributed the ashes of unborn calves for purification rituals. The Lupercalia, in February, where they prepared the sacred cakes. These weren't optional. These were duties that ensured Rome's survival. Miss them or perform them incorrectly, and the gods' anger would fall on the entire city. But here's what the ancient sources mostly don't tell you, because it was too ordinary to mention. Between the dramatic rituals and the sacred duties, there were thousands of hours of just living. 6 women in close quarters, bound by rules, but still human, still dealing with petty frustrations and genuine friendships, still navigating the complex social dynamics of any communal living situation. We catch glimpses in unusual sources. A letter from Pliny mentions that Vestals enjoyed attending literary readings. Inscriptions record gifts given by Vestals to each other. There are hints of factions within the order, of senior Vestals who were harsh taskmasters and others who were more lenient, of younger Vestals who chafed under restrictions and others who seemed content. They weren't living in blissful religious contemplation. They were living in an institutional setting with all the politics and personalities that implies. And overhanging everything was the knowledge that one false accusation, one political crisis, one lightning strike interpreted the wrong way, could end with burial alive. Several ancient authors record that some Vestals developed a distinctive walk, rapid with short steps, looking neither left nor right. It was the walk of women who knew they were constantly observed, constantly judged, constantly one mistake away from disaster. Now, I need to tell you about the other side of this story, the part that complicates the narrative of oppression even further. Some Vestals embraced their power. Some used their unique position to reshape Roman politics and society. In 63 BC, during Cicero's consulship, a Vestal named Fabia was present at the trial of Publius Claudius, Pulcher. Pulcher was accused of sacrilege. He disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate the rites of the goddess Bonide, a religious ceremony from which men were strictly excluded. The trial became a massive political scandal. Fabia testified. Her testimony was considered so important that both prosecution and defense built their cases partly around what she said. He was eventually acquitted, probably due to bribery, but Fabia's testimony remained influential. For years afterward, orators referenced it as the authoritative account of what had occurred that night. A woman had shaped the historical record of a major political event. This was almost unheard of in Roman society. Or consider the Vestals during the civil wars of the 1st century BC, when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome, when Pompey fled and the Republic tore itself apart, the Vestals maintained their position. Both sides courted their favor. Both sides wanted them to store important documents, to mediate disputes, to lend legitimacy to whatever regime emerged. The Vestals held Caesar's will. When he was assassinated, they produced it and read it publicly, revealing that he had adopted Octavian as his son and heir. That single act shaped the future of Rome. Without the Vestals' custody and revelation of Caesar's will, Octavian might never have become Augustus, might never have founded the empire. 6 women maintaining neutrality during a civil war determined who would rule the Roman world. This was agency, real political agency wielded by women who theoretically had no power in Roman politics. So, what are we to make of this system? Was it oppressive? Yes. Women were taken as children, stripped of the normal life course, forced into permanent virginity under threat of death, and occasionally used as human sacrifices. Was it empowering? Also, yes, Vestals had legal and political rights unprecedented for Roman women. They wielded genuine influence. They shaped policy and preserved culture. Some of them clearly found meaning and purpose in their service. The answer is that both are true, and that should make us deeply uncomfortable. We want clear narratives, oppressor and oppressed, powerful and powerless, but the Vestal system refuses to fit into those categories. It created a space where women could have power, but only by giving up what Roman society considered to be essential to womanhood: marriage, children, family. It honored them as sacred, but this sacred status made them available for sacrifice. It freed them from male control, but only by binding them to religious duties so strict that one mistake could mean death. And here's what I think is the most important thing to understand about the Vestals. The system worked. precisely because of these contradictions. Romans could point to Vestals as proof that women were valued, that they could have power and influence, that Roman society respected female virtue and capability. But the same system ensured that female power remained exceptional, liminal, always dependent on separation from normal life. A Vestal had rights because she wasn't really a woman in Roman legal and social categories. She was something else, something between categories, something that could be honored precisely because she was unique. The power of the Vestals didn't threaten the patriarchal structure of Roman society. It reinforced it. Look, Rome said, women can have tremendous power as long as they give up marriage, family, sexuality, motherhood, as long as they remain virgins serving the state, as long as they can be killed if they step out of line. This is why the story of the Vestals matters today, because we still see versions of this pattern. Exceptional women granted power as long as they remain exceptional, as long as they don't threaten the basic structures that limit women's agency. Tokens held up as proof that the system works, while the system continues to constrain the vast majority of women. The Vestals were real people who lived real lives, and some of them found genuine fulfillment in their service. I don't want to erase that, but they lived those lives within a system that was using them, that granted them privilege specifically to maintain structures of power that would kill them when politically convenient. In 394 AD, the Christian emperor Theodosius officially disbanded the Vestal order. The sacred flame was extinguished after more than 1,000 years. The house of the Vestals was closed. The last 6 Vestals, their names lost to history, were pensioned off and sent to live private lives. Rome didn't fall. The eternal flame went out and the city endured. The whole theological justification for the Vestals' existence, that Rome survived only because they kept the fire burning, was revealed to be myth. But for more than 1,000 years, generations of women had organized their entire lives around that myth, had given up marriage, family, and ultimately their lives to maintain a fire that in the end could be extinguished without consequence. What do we do with that knowledge? How do we honor the women who served while acknowledging the system that exploited them? How do we recognize their agency without erasing the constraints they faced? I don't have easy answers, but I know this. The Vestals deserve to be remembered as they actually were, not as symbols of ancient virtue or ancient oppression, but as real women navigating a system that gave them both power and vulnerability in equal measure. Valeria, buried alive in 114 BC for crimes she probably didn't commit. Julia, who dedicated an altar in 123 BC in an act of political defiance. Cornelia, executed by Domitian's paranoia in 90 AD. Junia Torquata, who served faithfully for 30 years and lived another 20 as a respected but socially ambiguous figure. The unnamed last 6 Vestals, who watched their order dissolve and their purpose declared irrelevant. They were Rome's most privileged women. They were Rome's most vulnerable women. They were both. And in that contradiction lies a truth about power, about gender, about how societies create and constrain the people within them, that resonates across 2,000 years. The House of the Vestals still stands in the Roman Forum. You can visit it today. The sacred flame is gone, the rituals have ceased, but the space remains, and with it the memory of the women who lived there. Next time you hear about the Vestal virgins in a documentary, in a novel, in casual conversation, remember that they were more complicated than any simple story can convey. They were privileged and endangered. They were honored and used. They were powerful and powerless. They were human, and their story is still teaching us if we're willing to listen to its complexities. What do you think? Does power that comes with impossible constraints really count as power? Can we admire the agency of the Vestals while condemning the system that constrained them? How do we balance honoring their service with recognizing their exploitation? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this deep dive into the complexities of ancient history valuable, subscribe for more stories that refuse to give you easy answers, because the truth rarely does.